don't need to be a monster to do monstrous things. You just need to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Lucifer Effect is not just a fascinating concept. It's a window into the human psyche. Its name comes from the biblical figure of Lucifer, the fallen angel, the one who had it all and yet chose the path of darkness. But we're not here to talk about religion. We're here to talk about psychology, philosophy, about you. Think of the cruelest person you can imagine, a tyrant, a war criminal, someone who has committed unimaginable acts against other human beings. Now think of someone kind, compassionate, incapable of causing harm. What sets them apart? Their genetics, their upbringing, or simply the circumstances they were placed in? What if I told you that you too could fall into this? That evil is not an exclusive trait of monsters, but a latent possibility within all of us. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo sought to answer one of the most disturbing questions about human nature: what turns us into executioners? To do so, he designed an experiment that ultimately revealed an uncomfortable truth about the fragility of our morals. An experiment that had to be shut down early because the line between simulation and reality so completely vanished. Imagine this. A group of students is divided into two groups, prisoners and guards, inside a simulated prison at Stanford University. They were just regular young people, like you, like me, with everyday lives, friends, aspirations. But the moment they were assigned their roles, everything changed. Day 1. The students are divided into prisoners and guards. It all seems like a simple role-playing exercise. The guards receive uniforms, sunglasses, and wooden batons. The prisoners, on the other hand, are dressed in gowns and assigned a number instead of a name. The atmosphere is tense, but controlled. Day 2. The guards begin to take their roles too seriously. Small orders turn into subtle abuses. What started as a prison simulation now becomes a real power struggle. The prisoners start showing signs of stress, and the guards grow more aggressive. Day 3. Violence erupts. Punishments, humiliation, submission. The prisoners begin to break down emotionally. They are forced to perform exhausting physical exercises and are denied basic comforts. Desperation takes hold, and some attempt to rebel, only to be punished even more severely. Day 4. The situation keeps escalating. The guards become increasingly sadistic, enjoying the power they have over the prisoners. Social and moral norms seem to disappear within the walls of the improvised prison. The prisoners are trapped in a cycle of abuse and submission, with no hope of escape. Day 5. The psychological pressure is unbearable. Some prisoners enter states of emotional shock, while others show signs of mental distress. The guards, blinded by power, ignore their cries for help and continue their abusive behavior. The experiment turns into a true battlefield between morality and blind obedience. Day 6. The experiment spirals out of control. Zimbardo, trapped in his own study, realizes the hell he has created. He watches in horror as ordinary everyday people have transformed into perpetrators and victims. Aware of the harm he is causing, he decides to put an immediate stop to the experiment. The experiment is cancelled, but the question lingers. To what extent could any of us become executioners if the circumstances allowed it? But the question lingers in the air. Were they monsters? No, they were ordinary people, like you, like me. But the damage was already done. The guards, regular individuals, had turned into sadistic figures. The prisoners, also students like them, had been reduced to utter despair, and all of this happened in less than a week. This is what Philip Zimbardo called the Lucifer Effect, proof that evil is not something inherent in people, but something that can emerge in anyone if the circumstances allow it. And this experiment is not just a theoretical exercise. Its echo reverberates through real history. In the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, the unthinkable became reality, a place meant to be just a detention center turned into a nightmare. U.S. soldiers, tasked with guarding detainees, carried out abuses so horrifying they could only be compared to the worst accounts of torture. Humiliation, suffering, dehumanization, and the most disturbing part, the perpetrators weren't monsters. They were ordinary people. People who, outside of that context, had families, laughed with friends, led normal lives. But within that structure, where their power had no limits and their actions had no immediate consequences, abuse became routine. Who do we become when no one is watching? Looking even further back, the Nuremberg Trials after World War II forced humanity to confront one of the most chilling questions in history. Nazi officers, responsible for atrocities that wiped out millions of lives, defended themselves with a phrase that still sends shivers down our spines. "I was just following orders." But does that absolve them of the irreversible? Were they monsters before the war? Or were they shaped by a system that stripped them of their humanity? They weren't born with a desire to commit genocide. They were transformed, dehumanized, turned into tools of a machine that allowed them to act without guilt, shielded by blind obedience. How much of that transformation could happen to any of us under the wrong circumstances? And here's where history leaves us with a warning. Dehumanization doesn't only happen on battlefields or in prisons. Imagine working at a company where everyone follows orders without question. One day your boss asks you to alter the results of a project to make them look better. Everyone does it. It seems minor. No one questions it. But you pause and think, what does this mean for my integrity? Am I willing to sacrifice my ethics just to fit in? Dehumanization doesn't start with grand atrocities. It seeps into the small, everyday choices, the compromises we make in the name of authority or convenience. And just like that, without realizing it, the line between right and wrong begins to blur. Until one day we find ourselves on the other side. So, tell me, have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt that what you were being asked to do wasn't right, but you did it anyway? Have you ever felt safer or more justified in your actions because you knew you wouldn't be identified? The reality is that we are surrounded by social forces that push us to conform, to do what is expected of us without questioning the morality of our decisions. Social pressures, the expectations of others, the fear of losing our position or reputation, all of these play a significant role in how we react when facing ethical dilemmas. Now, pause for a moment. Make a mental list of your principles, those values you consider unbreakable. Reflect on a time when those principles were put to the test. What did you do in that moment? Did you let yourself be influenced by external pressure, or did you stand firm in what you believed was right? Don't underestimate the importance of questioning your decisions at every step. The next time you face a dilemma, whether at work, in your personal life, or even in everyday interactions, ask yourself, am I acting according to my values, or am I just going with the flow? I want to hear from you. How would you react if you were asked to hurt someone? Even if it was something small, would you question it? Or would you do it simply because someone else asked you to? Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's reflect together on how to find that balance between staying true to our principles and navigating the world around us. And today, in the digital world, we can see a more subtle but equally destructive form of this phenomenon. The anonymity of the internet has turned ordinary people, who would never insult a stranger on the street, into cruel attackers on social media. They humiliate, threaten, dehumanize, because the screen gives them the same feeling that a uniform or a mask does: permission to act without real consequences. So, what drives us to become executioners? First, unchecked power. When someone is given authority without restrictions or clear consequences, abuse becomes tempting, not because they seek to harm from the start, but because the feeling of control is addictive. It's like a slow-acting poison. At first, it feels like just a small dose of power, but over time it spreads until it begins to distort our decisions and behavior. This is why power abuse is so common in institutions where control becomes an end in itself, just like in Zimbardo's experiment with the prison guards. But you don't have to be a prison guard to understand this. At work, in families, in politics, there's always someone with access to a little more power, and that's when one must ask, how am I using this power? Am I helping, or am I subjugating others? Second, loss of identity. When someone hides behind a uniform, a mask, or an ideology, their sense of personal responsibility fades. Individual identity dissolves into the crowd, and with it, guilt disappears. How far could any of us go if we found ourselves in the wrong environment? The real question is, how can we avoid falling into that trap? When a person hides behind a uniform, an ideology, or the anonymity of the internet, their sense of responsibility fades. They no longer act as an individual with their own judgment, but as just another cog in a system. And when we don't feel the weight of our decisions, justifying harm becomes dangerously easy. Think about this. How would your behavior change if you knew that no one would ever recognize you or hold you accountable for your actions? If you had total impunity, would you still act according to your values? This is why certain environments can be so dangerous. When we hide behind a uniform, a screen, or an ideology, the line between right and wrong becomes blurred. Blind obedience is another key factor. From a young age, we are taught to follow orders and respect authority, which is necessary for social order. But in extreme cases, this obedience turns into a dangerous weapon. How often do we question what we are told? The soldiers at Abu Ghraib, for example, were not born monsters. They were ordinary people who, under the premise of just following orders, committed unthinkable acts. In their minds, they were not responsible. They were merely executing what a higher structure dictated. This leaves us with an uncomfortable question. Do we really know when we are obeying for the greater good and when we are simply being swept along by the current? So, how do we avoid falling into these traps? How do we ensure that power doesn't corrupt us, that ideology doesn't dehumanize us, and that authority doesn't strip us of our moral judgment? The first step is awareness. We must learn to recognize the subtle signs that indicate we are straying from our values. For example, at work, if you start feeling that your position makes you superior to others, or that their needs no longer matter as much as your own interests, it's time to pause and reflect. Ask yourself, how do my actions affect others? The second step is questioning authority. This doesn't mean rebelling for the sake of it, but rather critically analyzing the orders we receive. Blind obedience can lead us to do things we never imagined. The next time someone asks you to do something that makes you uncomfortable or seems immoral, stop and ask yourself, why does this person have so much power over me? Is what they're asking truly aligned with the greater good? History has shown that no one is immune to these influences, but by staying aware and questioning the structures around us, we can resist the temptation to be led down that path. A practical example of this can be seen at work. Imagine your boss asks you to do something you don't consider ethical. Instead of obeying without question, you can start a conversation and discuss the possible negative impacts of that action. Many times, a simple question can make others reflect as well. But there's something even more powerful: empathy. It's the antidote to dehumanization. It's easy to see others as the other, but behind every person, there's a story, emotions, fears, and dreams. Practicing empathy doesn't require grand gestures. It can be as simple as asking genuine questions, actively listening, and trying to understand another person's perspective. This daily practice not only strengthens our relationships, but also protects us from falling into the emotional detachment that enables abuse of power. Now tell me, are you sure you would never fall into this? It's easy to believe that, in our current circumstances, we would never be swayed by power, ideology, or blind obedience. But history has shown time and time again that even the most ethical people can get swept away when circumstances change. And the most terrifying part, the victims are not always others. Evil consumes you too. It dehumanizes you. And when you finally realize what you've done, it might be too late. But there is a way to prevent it: recognizing the signs, questioning authority, and keeping empathy alive. Evil is not a monster lurking in the shadows. It is not something foreign to us. It is a latent possibility within every person, waiting for the right moment to emerge. But it's also a reminder of what we stand to lose, or the humanity we can still preserve if we remain vigilant. So the next time you find yourself in a situation where your morals are tested, remember, evil doesn't start with a monster. It starts with a choice. And in the end, that choice is always yours. Now tell me, are you completely sure you would never fall into the Lucifer effect? Let me know in the comments. After all, understanding our darkness is the first step to embracing our light. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, because as I always say, the truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth it. Until next time, explorer of the mind.